It's a question of empathy, which is every single generation is affected by the significant events of the day as you go through your formative years, right? So if you grew up during the Great Depression, or the Second World War, odds are you may end up a little frugal or miserly. Like your grandparents who insist that you get every drop of toothpaste because they grew up during rations, that's why, right? It's like it's not such a departure. And it affected an entire generation in the way they see the world because that's when they sort of formed their worldview during this time period. And if you grew up during the Vietnam War and Richard Nixon, if that's when you came of age in your teenage years, odds are you're a little cynical of authority figures. Well, if you happen to have come of age during the millennium, the turn of the century, for the first time in our lives where technology was ubiquitous, for the first time in our lives where we're a global society, properly, for the first time in our lives where these new parenting theories were being tested out, like Purelling your kids every 2 minutes. There's good data on that, by the way. Kids who grow up unpurelled, in other words, in dirtier environments, actually grow up with fewer health problems than kids who are overpurelled. You can see it in the revised chapter of. And so my point was
coming in a month.
Yeah, coming in a month. Maybe let's not judge a generation for being lazy or entitled, that there's something wrong with them. Like there's nothing wrong with our grandparents because they're miserly or frugal. Let us simply try to understand what was happening when a generation came of age. And that's what I broke it down. I simply broke it down into these 4 points, which is let's understand the parenting strategies under which they grew up, which were different than previous generations. Let us understand the role of technology and the addictive qualities of technology, which is now being talked about a lot more just on 60 Minutes this last weekend. And we wrote about it in 2014. You know, the addictive qualities. It's all in that book. We talk about the addictive qualities of technology. I'm glad it's getting more airplay and that real scientists are actually talking about it. I think that's important. You know, like we all up in arms because cigarette companies added nicotine to cigarettes knowing that it was addictive to addict people to their product, yet nobody is up in arms that coders are adding addictive code knowing that it addicts people to their product. Like, why aren't we just as incensed? It's the same thing, it's just that it's not a substance, it's code, it's technical, it's digital. Just because it's imaginary to many of us, we think it doesn't exist. And we're seeing the impact, we're seeing rise in suicide rates amongst all generations. Do you want to take a guess which demographic has the single largest delta increase, or the biggest, not necessarily by sheer number, but percent increase of suicide? Do you want to take a random stab? Girls 10 to 15 years old. It has tripled in the past 15 years. Tripled. Girls also spend 40% more time on social media than boys. It's not a causal relationship, but there's definitely a correlation. Enough to scare me that I think we should at least be having the discussion and raising some very difficult questions, both as parents and our responsibility as organizations. And then I talk about the role of corporations, which is we're now dominated by business philosophies that are largely left over from the 80s and 90s. The use of mass layoffs on an annualized basis to balance the books, which is so normal now we don't even think it's a big deal. You know, a friend of mine got laid off. It's not even reported on the news. In fact, worse, when it is reported on the news, the stock price goes up, right? Did you know that mass layoffs did not exist in the United States prior to the 1980s? Did not exist. Didn't exist. It was a theory that was popularized in the 80s and 90s by folks like Jack Welch and those who followed him, right? The concept of shareholder supremacy, where we prioritize the needs of an external constituency over the needs of an internal audience, which is the exact same philosophy as listening to your fans' wants over the needs of your players. That's what shareholder supremacy is, right? That idea of doing something for shareholder value was a theory proposed in the late 1970s, popularized in the 80s and 90s. Those were boom years of relative peace. These are no longer boom years, and it's no longer relative peace. The times are different, and yet the theories have not changed. And yet we run our businesses with business theories left over from the 80s and 90s, where we prioritize numbers over people, and it is destructive. The irony is is for companies that reject those theories, they actually do better. That's the great irony. They're nicer to work at. We prefer working at those companies. They have much higher rates of trust and cooperation and engagement, innovation. It's actually better for business. That's the great irony. And so when you take a young audience, a young employee of a millennial generation who's come up with weird parenting, overprotective parents in a world in which technology has dominated their life with some detriment, yes, huge advantages, and the balanced detriment, and then you plunk them into a corporate environment that does not care about them as human beings and sees them only as line items on a spreadsheet. And if you miss your numbers, arbitrary numbers that year, we just slash a round of less. Nobody feels safe. However, is this generation going to grow up and learn trust and cooperation and love for each other and love for themselves if the corporations themselves aren't willing to pick up some of the slack? And I hear this all the time from corporate leaders who say, it's not my responsibility. Well, they're your employees, and it's not just the young employees, it's all your employees. You should take care of all your employees. I don't care what age they are. Everybody wants to feel like they belong. Everybody wants to feel like their boss actually wants to know who they are as a human being. Everybody wants to feel that if they have a bad day, instead of getting in trouble, if you miss your numbers, instead of somebody walking into your office and saying, you've missed your numbers for the third quarter in a row, if you don't hit them for the fourth quarter, I can't guarantee you're going to have a job. Instead, walk into your office and say, you've missed your numbers for the third quarter in a row, are you okay? I'm worried about you. Like, that's where we all want to work. God bless millennials that they're the ones actually speaking up. The rest of us just suffer in silence. So that's what I was trying to say in that millennial answer, which is, let us have a little empathy and understand both, yes, there is personal responsibility that they have, of course, but let us understand our role as well. You know, we're so fond of telling millennials, you're the future leaders, and yet we forget that we're the leaders now. Like, we're the one breaking everything, you know? So I think there's a mutual responsibility, enough responsibility to go all around for us to take care of each other.